Good morning, Nicole. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Absolutely very proud of you because, for the longest time, I've always sat here and said, we cannot lose history. We can't just shove it to the side and pretend things didn't happen. And it takes confidence from you as well as your writing skills to bring a story like this forward so that one moment in time is here in this present time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Aw.
How did you even come across this story? I mean, I'm here in the South. I mean, your journey started in Atlanta, the story.
Right. So one of the producers at iHeart at the time approached me with the story. And when he was telling me about Eunice Carter, I actually was a little angry because I had never heard of her. I am also from the South. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, which is about a 4-hour drive from Atlanta. And I could not believe that I had not heard of this woman. And so when I started doing the research and, started reading, I actually got even angrier because I was like, she was fascinating. She was incredible. And I cannot believe that she is not as much of a household name as any of these other gangsters, that we know about. So I was all in as soon as I, learned about her story. And one of the reasons that I wanted to keep telling it, one of the reasons that I wanted to tell it was because Black history is being erased, in states like Florida, where AP Black history is being removed from classrooms and things like that. And I was just like, no, we cannot let this woman continue to fall through the cracks. And so I was thrilled to join the team and make sure that Eunice Carter's story continues to be told.
Well, see, that's every bit the reason why I'm so proud of you is because we do know that they are erasing history from our existence is what they're doing. But you know what? They're not shutting down podcasts yet. And so we need people like yourself to dedicate, your journey to keep stories like this alive.
Thank you. It is truly an honor to do it. And I hope that, it reaches as many people as it needs to. It's not necessarily about numbers, but just like who needs this story, who needs to hear it. And hopefully, the right person will hear it and maybe they'll end up going to law school or make a movie out of her story. I don't know what needs to happen, but I hope it reaches all the right people.
The podcast we're talking about is The Godmother. And you know what's really interesting about this? Because the two of us here in the South, we didn't know the story, but yet it was called The Trial of the Century. And it's like, what? Why don't I know the players of this?
I mean, ultimately, I think it just goes back to that messy intersection of race and gender politics. This Eunice was a Black woman in the 1930s, and she wasn't actually even in court during the trial.
Right.
And we're not really sure why she was not there, but she was not there to witness, the fruits of her labor, so to speak, because without her, that trial of the century would not have happened. And she was actually very famous in her own right, even before the trial. Eunice's family was from Atlanta. They moved to Harlem after the 1906 race riots. And she had gone on to law school. She was there in Harlem at the height of the Harlem Renaissance. So she was a Harlem socialite. She hobnobbed with Madam C.J. Walker's family. She was actually in the wedding party of Madam C.J. Walker's daughter. So she was very much a part of the who's who of Harlem. So she was very well known even before her connection to Lucky Luciano. Her name was in all of the newspapers, and not just the Black newspapers, but every, major newspaper in the country. So she was very well known at the time. And so when she ended up associated with Thomas Dewey, the district attorney Thomas Dewey, who ultimately became governor of New York, she was very well known, and she was fascinating already. I'm sorry, what is the question? I was just rambling.
Oh, no, you're doing absolutely fine because, you're explaining the entire story the way that you explain it throughout the podcast. And in fact, I'm going to give you a compliment on that, on how you do take the time to explain this to us in a way that doesn't belittle us. You like, for instance, like the way the family moved to Atlanta, why Atlanta became the city that it is, with the Black community, and what happened in Harlem. You patiently take us as listeners into an area of explaining why these moves took place and why it was so important for history to play out the way it did.
Yeah, because there's so much more to the story than just oh, there are a bunch of Italian mobsters in New York, right? Because you have to take into consideration the Great Migration. How did Harlem become this incredible Black Mecca, right? In its own way. And that is because of the Great Migration, people moving away from the South because of things like the Atlanta race riots, which was a result of a gubernatorial race that was going on, and the candidates kind of stirring the pot, getting Atlanta residents riled up to the point that they attacked the Black neighborhoods in Atlanta, and created this unfortunate historical event that sent Eunice's family to Harlem. And then Harlem, as we know, is just an incredible melting pot of communities that Eunice was a part of. And so Prohibition happened, which was the, ban of consumption and sale of alcohol. Yep. But that's not going to stop people from getting alcohol. Like we know that. So, we have all these speakeasies, we have these hotels, the saloons, all that kind of thing. They still needed their liquor. And so they turned to gangsters. They turned to the mafia to get them their liquor. Well, when Prohibition ended, the mafia needed to figure out, well, how are we going to recoup the money that we've lost now that anybody can just go to the liquor store to get their liquor. And so the mob decided to turn to Harlem and the Harlem numbers rackets. They decided to focus more on prostitution, sex work, bringing in money, because that is also something that people are going to get no matter how illegal it may be. And ultimately, that's how Eunice's and Lucky Luciano's paths crossed. And in the podcast, we also talk about, the parallels between their lives. You have Lucky Luciano's family also came to New York in hopes of a better life, right? As many people did at the turn of the century. And so we have all these parallels between them, and they chose very different paths. One person chose the law, someone chose not the law. And they still intersected at one point. And part of Eunice's work, when she became a lawyer, she worked at the Women's Court, which is where we dealt with all of the women's crimes and, women who were arrested. And she noticed that the prostitutes, certain groups of prostitutes were coming in, but were being bailed out almost immediately, or were not seeing any court time at all. Oh, and she realized they were all being bailed out by the same person. And that person had direct connections to the mob and to Lucky Luciano. So she gathered up this information. She gave it to her boss, Thomas Dewey. And at first, Thomas Dewey was a little reluctant, because he didn't want to go the Al Capone route, right? Which was, like, we all know that Al Capone was caught on tax evasion and not all of the other terrible things that he was doing. He didn't want to do that. He had set up this whole narrative of taking out the evil that was destroying America, right? He wanted it to be a big show, but he had to, kind of resort to the information that Eunice put together. He realized that actually her information was solid. It was correct. It was good. And so he went with it. And that is pretty much how we ended up getting Lucky Luciano on trial for compulsion, which is, compelling women into a life of sex work, as opposed to kind of, letting it happen naturally, forcing these women to into a life that maybe they would not have chosen otherwise. A polite radio way of saying that.
I do love the way that you describe what he was going through while up there on the stand, that he knew he was busted. He knew that it was over. And just the way that you describe that scene, because I mean, a lot of listeners don't understand that with a podcast like this, with the music, with the people telling the stories with you, you really put us in that zone of becoming a part of it. It's almost like wearing a pair of ocular goggles.
Wow. Thank you so much. The person who did our music, I just want to shout him out since you mentioned the music. That is the critically acclaimed jazz musician, Jeff Parker, who was incredible. Yeah, he was incredible. The music is fantastic. Jeff Parker was awesome with the music. He really captured the mood and the time. we wanted to make sure that the listeners felt immersed in the story as much as possible. And, I also contributed a little bit of my own family history a little bit at one point, in order to, again, kind of draw some parallels that these things are still happening, because, we think about numbers runners in Harlem. Well, there was someone in my family who was running numbers at one point, even way down in Nashville, Tennessee. So there is still like a lot of history, relevant in this story. So we wanted to make sure the listeners to, pay attention, that they weren't being spoon-fed the information, and that it was interesting to them, and that hopefully it inspires them to dig a little further into the story, not just about Lucky Luciano, but obviously about Eunice Carter herself.
Yeah, because, you do invite us to dig in our own communities. It's like, okay, what don't I know about my town that I should know? And it really does begin that path of doing your own exploring. Now, the fact that you got 8 episodes out of this, there had to have been more, that you guys just said, okay, now we got to cut it back to 8, because this story is a continuation of our present life.
Right. We did want more episodes at one point, and we did trim them down to the 8, because, this is a story that could go on forever, because we could talk about, the legacies that Eunice has inspired for other Black women lawyers, for other lawyers, period, because she continued to do legal work, and eventually she stopped. She decided to step away from law, and she became more involved in the United Nations and the International Council of Women. So she was doing a lot of international work, especially for women's rights. So she had a very full life. She passed in 1970. She was born in 1899 and passed in 1970. So she witnessed a lot of history herself. Not only was she creating history, but she witnessed so many changes to America. And she left her mark. And it's unfortunate that we kind of have to brush away a lot of dirt to see her mark. But she's still in American history, very much so.
She was known for her writing, and that fascinates me because I believe that writers have a keen eye. In other words, that we like to watch everything around us. And it makes me wonder if that's what led her to going into becoming a social worker and then going toward, to become a lawyer, in the way that it's like she had that writing skill, but she had a keen eye of watching what was right, what was wrong, and everything played out like a book.
Yeah, I think so. She was a writer. She had some things published during the Harlem Renaissance. I do think that is part of her success. She was very meticulous. Yeah. She had a reputation for being very meticulous and diligent and hardworking. So I think that is part of why she was able to recognize the patterns that were happening in the women's court so easily, where other people had overlooked them. So her skills as a writer definitely contributed to her success as a lawyer, for sure.
Where did you discover your art of storytelling? Because your voice is perfect for this moment, and the way that it mixes in with everything else. I mean, did you ever? Because we radio people grow up with program directors. What is your background to where you're speaking so perfectly in tune?
Oh, well, I've always been a writer in some way myself. I am a writer. I've been fascinated by storytelling all my life. When I was a little girl, the first thing that I wrote that I can remember is a murder mystery story. And I write poetry. I think my skills as a poet also play a role, because you have to, in poetry, you are usually very concise, right? You kind of have to get in and get out, say what you need to say, or say what you don't want to say, and drop that. So I think that also helps with my background. A lot of the work, I do a lot of culture work where I am looking at pop culture through a Black feminist lens. So I am looking at the intersections of race and gender and sex a lot. So all those things kind of blend together to give me my voice. I appreciate you noticing it. Thank you.
Well, because it's standing out. I had a conversation yesterday about the Berkeley movement out in California and how that changed things in the 60s and 70s. And I think that we're headed back into that kind of a moment now. And we need writers like yourself who are not only journalists, but you're also historians. And you're not afraid to get in there, get the story, share the story, ignite the activation.
Right. I mean, it's very important to me. Artists are a reflection of our times. They are telling the story of what they see. And those stories have so many capillaries, there's so many branches to everything. We do not exist in a vacuum.
Right.
And so all of these things compel us as artists to tell a story, whether we are on the radio, making sure people hear good music or hear good news stories or hear, the podcast, or we're writing these things to be, distributed through publishing or through whatever means, blogging, whatever. We have to tell the story, and these stories can't exist if we're all just in our rooms and nothing happens to us. And things happen to us because we are a part of the world, and people are making decisions in the world. They're taking away freedoms and allowing freedoms. And I think that is also part of why people are attracted to the stories of mobsters and gangsters, because it's actually a story of government overreach. It's actually a story of sticking it to the man, right? Like, how can we keep the government out of our business? Who are you to tell me I can't drink alcohol, right? I am going to make sure that I get my liquor one way or another, right? Who are you to tell me that I'm only allowed to make this kind of money, and I get this money and I have to give half of it back to you, that kind of thing. And then, people are just also fascinated by bad guys, because we have been told since we were little kids, when you do a bad thing, you're going to get punished for it. When you do a bad thing, you have to be held accountable for that thing. And then sometimes gangsters are not held accountable. Yeah. And it's, we have to we're trying to figure out, how much can we get away with in our lives? What if, we do a morally gray thing? Am I going to get punished for it? And so we use art not only as escape, but sometimes without even knowing it, we're using it as a guide, as our own little instruction manual. And, whatever that says about us as humanity, we're just fascinated by these stories. And so you have Eunice Carter, who is looking at these stories, looking at these women who, chose a certain path, and she's trying to get them out however she can by, throwing the man who compelled them to do this thing in jail. I think that's part of her story as well. So you have both of these people, Eunice Carter, Lucky Luciano, trying to figure out their lives, the best way to live their lives. And sometimes they make interesting decisions.
God, I love the way you podcast. I know that there won't be another season of this one, but there's no way that you're going to walk away from or turning down another one, and I look forward to talking to you when you do create that next podcast, because you really have it. You really have it.
Oh, thank you so much. I love doing this kind of stuff. I love telling stories. I love especially telling Black women's stories. So yeah, I would love to do another one just like this.
Excellent. Well, you'll be brilliant today, okay?
Thank you. You too.